Welcome to the interactive lecture for Unit 6B, What Does the Evidence Mean? And the idea of these interactive lectures is that they give you an opportunity to be briefed as to the content of the particular unit, but then an opportunity to reflect on what you've heard and then to post comments to the video. And then as part of the interactive tutorial later in the week, we will then address some of your comments and questions. And so I thought it might be helpful to put the questions that we're going to be asking you to comment on at the beginning of this presentation. I will repeat them at the end and remind you as to the process. But what we want you to do is think of reports and evidence that you've used and to particularly highlight what features that you've identified that make them easier to use. So what make them more likely to be picked up by a policymaker, to be read by a policymaker, and to be actioned by a policymaker. And for this particular exercise, of course, you can think of evidence in any form, whether it be in the form of guidelines or local recommendations, whether this be clinical or health service level interventions. And then we'd like you to reflect on what challenges you face in getting evidence read and acted upon by local decision makers, and also responding to that, what sort of solutions that you can suggest to improve the use of evidence in your local context. So we're very interested in how you bring to bear your knowledge of your patch, the particular constraints and barriers that you face. And if you don't have anything to contribute on these three particular topics, or you have additional comments you'd like to make, or things that perhaps aren't clear from the presentation, then please also record these in the comments feature of this YouTube video. So let's just give you an outline of what we're going to be covering in this mini lecture. We're going to look at analysis of the evidence, the different ways in which evidence is applied, how recommendations are produced and made more effective. We're going to look at the role of evidence summaries and a particular structure used increasingly in government decision making, the 1-page, 3-page, 25-page structure. So let's start with the first of these topics, the analysis of the evidence. And when you're bringing together the evidence from your different sources, in our case we would have one systematic review, one quantitative study, one qualitative study, but indeed there may be many of these studies, and indeed too they may be supplemented by local data. How do the different types of evidence mesh together? Now, in some cases, they will be synergistic. For example, the quantitative evidence on what works and the qualitative evidence on what people respond to positively, they may point towards the same option. And in which case, as long as other constraints such as cost and skills are able to be overcome, you have a fairly firm steer towards a particular policy option. On the other hand, they may be antagonistic. A drug, for example, may be very effective, but if people don't take it, if they have a negative attitude towards it, then compliance will be low at a population level, and therefore the effectiveness will be diluted. And so if considering an alternative option that may be less effective in laboratory terms, but in the real world is more acceptable, it may be that you settle for an option different from the one that the effectiveness information first points you towards. Of course, one of the benefits of using research from different paradigms, the quantitative and qualitative paradigms, is that they may have a complementary function, so that they will help round out the picture for decision making and help you feel that you're able to take multiple factors into consideration in making your decision. But finally, and not unusually, bringing together quantitative and qualitative and a systematic review may reveal some gaps, and these gaps may be gaps in the research that's being carried out, or they may be unknowns, things that policymaker doesn't know, and therefore which increases the uncertainty around the decision. And in that case, some consultation with experts, perhaps some rapid local data collection, perhaps some review of routine data may help to plug those gaps in a speedy fashion. Now, moving on to applying the evidence, it's very interesting to see that policymakers use evidence and research knowledge in different ways. And Lavis et al., you'll see that name figure frequently for the rest of this module, points to the three different ways that policymakers use evidence. Perhaps the one that's clearest in your mind, because this is what your own briefs are aiming for, is instrumental use of research evidence. This is where a policymaker would read your research, your summary, and that they would act in a specific direct ways, responding to the recommendations that you've made. The second use is conceptual use. This is where research results are used for more general enlightenment. So it may help the policymaker move towards a particular decision, but it's more difficult to attribute the decision to the research knowledge as captured in your evidence brief. And then finally, and unfortunately not uncommonly, there's the symbolic use of research, which is where the policymaker really has their stance predetermined and the research is really there just to back them up, to reinforce what they were planning to do anyway. And in that case, evidence is being used symbolically, perhaps to add a little bit of weight or impetus in driving forward the policy decision. And this distinction has been studied in the context of Canadian federal and provincial government, and this revealed that conceptual use of research is more frequent than instrumental use, and particularly in the day-to-day professional activity of professionals and managers in government agencies, and that instrumental utilisation is actually the least common, so it's harder to attribute use of evidence to the production of, for example, an evidence brief with clear recommendations. So we might think a negative picture here. On the other hand, the fact that the evidence is being used at all is certainly an improvement that we've seen over the last 15 or 20 years. Now moving on to producing recommendations. There aren't really structures for recommendations that are universally accepted for evidence briefs as a whole, but we can certainly learn a lot by looking at the recommendations from the BMJ for presenting the recommendations for research. So the mnemonic here is EPICOT, the acronym to help us remember. So the evidence, the population, the intervention, the comparison, the outcome, the timestamp, and optional elements are the disease burden or relevance, the time as a factor in the core elements of EPICOT, and the study type. So you could, for example, formulate a recommendation on the basis of a qualitative report looking at school children who were administered a water cooler compared with those who haven't. The outcome was a slight reduction in sugary drinks, but not significant, and this occurred within a whatever it is, 3-month period or whatever. And this is the evidence as of 2013. So you can see that there's a precision there to this formulation of research results. However, one of the frequent flaws of recommendations is that they don't always recommend who is responsible for a particular action. And I just want to compare 3 different ways of formulating recommendations with a view to shaping how you write your evidence brief and its recommendations. The first, it is really important that sales of fizzy drinks be reduced. That is abstract. It doesn't attribute responsibility to any one person. public health board should take steps to reduce. Well, they would probably agree, but you need to be able to isolate a particular individual. And so preferable is to have either a named person or a named role. So in this case, each director of public health in a particular health authority is responsible for reducing. This is a much more concrete recommendation. In terms of being able to communicate the evidence, these are going to be dealt with in more detail in the reading material, but some of the aspects that policymakers like to see, they need to know what the evidence says, but also what it doesn't say, what its limitations are. They generally want you to avoid recommendations. As we see, that's slightly different for your task because you're required to produce recommendations, but very often that's part of the implementation process. They want to have a good picture of context, they want clear language, they want to have the evidence presented at the right moment to fit their own timescales, and they typically like this 1:3:25 format. And so that's what we're going to move to with this slide. This is a research study that compares different formats given to decision makers, and it looks at such things as the value and accessibility, the clarity, and the quality of the evidence. And what it reveals is that a graded entry format like the 1:3:25 approach rates more highly with decision makers than a systematic review format. And in a way, this is a justification for this particular module because this has been produced as an alternative to a more conventional systematic reviews module. So the 1:3:25 structure is perhaps the best known example of a graded entry format. It starts with a page with 4 to 6 main messages. It's followed up with an executive summary, which will be up to 3 pages with more detail. The findings then go into a section of 25 pages, and then the data, which can be quite significant when you've been reviewing the literature, would go into appendices to which the decision maker can refer to separately if required. So what are the take-home messages for this particular interactive lecture? That when we're performing the analysis of the evidence, we must seek to reconcile the different sources, to make sense of them, to organize them so we have a clear and unambiguous message, even if the evidence itself could be regarded as ambiguous. Secondly, that the applicability of the evidence means to say that you will take into account local factors that will have a bearing on perhaps global evidence in making a particular option either more or less effective. And these local factors may be identified through comparative data, through benchmarking, or from the opinions of local people on the ground. We've seen that presentation of evidence must be accurate, brief and clear, and that the 1:3:25 format is an example of this graded entry format. So just a reminder, the questions we'd like you to consider and to post at the foot of the YouTube video. We'd like you to think of features of reports that make them easy to use. We'd like you to think of challenges that you face in getting evidence read and acted upon by people locally. We'd like you to think of solutions to improve the use of evidence in your local context. And we're happy to have any comments or questions about this lecture. And so just a reminder that you're to post your responses to that slide at the foot of the video in YouTube, or alternatively, if you have technical problems, you can email your response to myself at a.booth@sheffield.ac.uk. Remember that the deadline is Wednesday of week 10, because on Wednesday evening, GMT, and also on Thursday lunchtime and Friday morning, we'll be running interactive tutorials for half an hour which consider the questions you've raised and the issues and concerns. And this will be a way of reinforcing your learning for the module. And just a reminder that this is part of your engagement with the course, so each student is expected to post at least one comment or response, but you can focus on the particular area that is of interest to you. Thank you for your attention. I hope you enjoy this particular session.